I'll let people settle in just a little bit more. Al talked about difficulty sometimes talking after you've had too much coffee, but there's difficulty talking after you've had too much lunch too. But I'll do my best, and I'll try to keep you awake. Never the enviable task of having to speak after lunch, but particularly one as good as that one was. But we'll do the best I can. He tasked me with doing soil health. Actually, when we were in Michigan in September, we had some excellent presenters on soil health. We had Don Rakowski from Minnesota, former ARS researcher up there, done a tremendous amount of research on soil health. And we had Jerry Hatfield out of the Soil Tilth Lab, or used to be the Soil Tilth Lab. I can't remember. I don't know what they call it now at Ames, Iowa, but Jerry's a wonderful presenter as well. Dwayne Beck from the Dakota Lakes Research Center. I was going to say Land O'Lakes, but that's Minnesota. But and Dwayne's always been an inspiration to me. Dwayne always tells it like it is. And so you might see a little bit of all of their presentations sprinkled in. Jill Clapperton's another one I ought to mention. Jill is a soil rhizosphere ecologist. She's formerly from Canada, worked at the University of Alberta up there, I believe. And now she's running a consulting business out in Montana. And so you might see a little bit of Jill's stuff in here too. So I draw inspiration from a lot of different people. Start with a little bit about the impact of climate change. The guys this morning did a great job. Ken did a great job setting up my talk. Actually, I think he's kind of a wannabe agronomist, I think, from this discussion of crop physiology and those types of things. So I appreciate that. This study was one that was recently done by ARS. Actually, Jerry Hatfield was the lead author on this study. And it concluded basically that climate change could have a drastic harmful effect on agriculture in the United States. Warmer temperatures impact crop growth and development, as Ken so eloquently discussed this morning. And it could make fighting pests, weeds, and diseases a little bit more difficult. So there's some challenges ahead. Changes in growing season length precipitation patterns will impact cropping systems, what we grow, where we can grow it. So there will be some changes there too, and we'll need to adapt to those things. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration had a nice article for several weeks actually, or months, on the weather. When I pulled up my weather thing at work, it talked about 2012 being the hottest year ever in the United States since record keeping began. And it was like 1895. Much of the nation was impacted by a severe or extreme drought in the summer of 2012. And much of the Central U.S. is still in a severe or extreme drought. Borrowed these from the drought monitor from the drought center there at UNL. And you can see that the central part of the United States is still being pretty severely impacted. This was the last map as of February 5th. And if we look at it regionally, these 6 states, basically currently 92%, or at least 87% are in severe or extreme or exceptional drought currently. And as of, let's see, back at the start of the water year, 83.8% are in severe or extreme drought. A little bit better to the east of us, so things might be improved a little bit in Michigan and thereabouts. There they've actually had a decrease. They, at one point, at the start of the water year, which was September 25th, they were about 42% in extreme or severe category, and they've moderated down to about 26% now. So it's improved a little bit to the east of us. My talk is on soil health as maybe a way of developing some resilience in our agroecosystems to deal with the change in climate that we're experiencing. Soil health, soil quality. You probably hear both terms. I've heard both terms. For a long time in NRCS, we talked about soil quality. And then all of a sudden now we're talking about soil health. And I'm going, okay, well, what is the difference between soil quality and soil health? Some people do try to differentiate it. They say that soil quality refers to those inherent properties of the soil, such as the texture and the depth and drainage, or hydrology, things that we can't really change or manipulate with management practices. So some soils are inherently better than other soils just based on the parent material they formed in. We've been blessed in this part of the world with soils that have been formed in deep, lost parent materials that are really very forgiving soils. But there's places, even out in the western part of the state, where you're just 2 feet from nothing. You get rid of that 2 feet of soil, you've got nothing left out there. So there are inherent differences. And they use soil health to refer to more of those dynamic soil properties, things that we can change with management. And those would include organic matter, bulk density, aggregate stability, among other things. But by definition, they both really come out very similar to each other, and so you'll hear me use them interchangeably. You'll hear a lot of people use them interchangeably. Soil quality / soil health is basically the capacity of the soil to function within its natural or managed ecosystem boundaries to sustain plant and animal productivity, maintain or enhance water quality and air quality, and support human health and habitation. And that's a great definition. That was Doug Carlin did that back in 1997. He, by the way, is another K-State graduate. Actually, so is Jerry Happ. There's a lot of good K-Staters out there. All right, what are the functions of soils? We want to address the ability of soil to function. So what are some of those functions? One of the primary functions that we're concerned about as producers, ag producers, is maintaining that productivity. We want our soil to be a productive resource. And we want to, from the soil health standpoint, we want to maintain some biodiversity from the, what do you call it, what is it? Your farm health, or that's not right. What do you? Your health tool you have, but it's a farm health tool. So maintaining biodiversity and productivity is certainly a soil function that we're concerned about. Another big one is partitioning water solute flow. When does the water run off? We'll talk quite a little bit about that one. Filtering and buffering, probably won't talk about that too much, but the soil is a tremendous buffer. Particularly if we get those, riparian areas and things like that, they do perform a big ecosystem service by removing pollutants from the water before it enters our streams, rivers, lakes, and wetlands. So there's some filtering and buffering that goes on there. I'm not going to talk about that too much today, but it's certainly an interest. In terms of enhancing soil quality to protect water quality, that's a key. Nutrient cycling. A lot of nutrient cycling, or almost all the nutrient cycling, goes on in the soil, and we can do things to enhance that. And that's will be discussed. And then structural support, not only for plants, but also we use our soils to build on as well. And sometimes the properties that we're interested in for productivity, as opposed to those that we're interested in for building a road, may differ with each other. We may do things to build a road that we don't want to do to keep the soil productive agriculture. Just kind of a schematic that shows biological diversity and how that's important in maintaining biological activity in the soil, and consequently then the more diverse and active you've got that soil system working, the better our productivity is going to be. Partitioning water and solute flow. Particularly in times when water is in short supply, as it was this past summer, getting that water into our soil is key to really helping us maximize the productivity of that particular resource. And I know that one of our producers that was growing a lot of cover crops, what I was talking about, he didn't seem to see quite the impact of the drought this year that some of his neighbors did. And he said that maybe it's we either got more rain, or maybe it's the fact that I'm managing my system a little better and more of the rain that falls is getting into that soil profile. Filtering and buffering basically tries to detoxify, it immobilizes things, it takes nutrients out and all of that, and before it reaches the water table or again gets into our streams, lakes, or wetlands. Nutrient cycling, I noticed in this particular slide, it functions on really those 4 primary nutrients that we find in soil organic matter, and carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, and sulfur. And that's a key function, and we'll talk an awful lot about soil organic matter. Soil quality indicators, basically they're physical, chemical, biological properties or processes and characteristics that we can measure to monitor changes in soil health. What are some of those soil quality indicators? Number 1 on my list, and this should be number 1 on most lists, is organic matter. And organic matter affects almost everything else on the list, with the exception maybe of pH. I suppose there might be an effect there, but I'm not sure quite how organic matter affects pH, but it does affect everything else on this list. Aggregate stability. Number 1, got to keep those water-stable aggregates in the soil. So the water gets into the soil. Someone else talked about that today. Larry did. I was impressed to see Larry talk about the importance of trying to keep the soil well aggregated and get the water into the soil. Bulk density, while aggregate stability, bulk density, porosity, they're all related to each other. And they're all related to that organic carbon. Infiltration, again, all comes back to organic matter, aggregate stability. Available water holding capacity. To some extent related to, again, the porosity of the soil, the bulk density of the soil, but also we'll talk about the fact that organic matter itself is a great sponge. pH, that's the one I'm not sure how organic matter relates to it. Nutrient availability, it's certainly related there. We talked about nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. All primary soil component or soil source of those nutrients is the organic carbon or the organic fraction of the soil. And then it impacts the nutrient holding capacity of the soil as well. Soil respiration is related to organic carbon. We got to keep the bugs fed, got to keep the bugs happy in order to make the soil function the way we'd like it to. So what is soil organic matter? It's basically a wide range of organic substances, which includes living organisms. We call that the soil biomass. The remains of those organisms, which once occupied the soil, as well as the remains of plants, plant roots and crop residues, and then organic compounds that are produced through the metabolism of those organic residues in the soil. Basically, if we look at what the composition is, about less than 5% is living organisms, which doesn't sound like much, but it's a very significant 5%. That fresh residue readily breaks down. We have an active fraction, and I think the percentages here might be a little high. I've seen them somewhat lower for that active organic matter fraction. It's where most of the nutrient cycling takes place, is in that active organic matter fraction. That's one of the things that we attempt to measure in terms of trying to evaluate the soil health or quality of the soil. And then we have the stabilized organic matter, the humus, and it breaks down much more slowly. It cycles much more slowly. We can enhance how quickly that breaks down if we do an excessive amount of tilling. What are some of the functions then of soil organic matter? It improves soil structure. It enhances water nutrient holding capacity, nutrient cycling, provides carbon and energy to those soil organisms, very important from that standpoint. And let's just talk about some of those individual things. Soil structure is basically the arrangement of our primary soil particles into aggregates. So soils are textures, sand, silt, and clay. We kind of group those things together into soil aggregates, and that's what we describe as soil structure. It affects bulk density, porosity, infiltration, drainage, aeration. Factors which affect aggregate formation include physical processes, chemical processes, and biological processes. Look at some of those. The physical processes include shrink-swell, wetting and drying cycles, as well as freeze-thaw cycles. And I think one winter we went through a pretty mild winter, and I know summer producers were fussing about how hard their soil was. And part of the reason their soils were not quite as friable as they might like them to be in the spring is that we didn't have those freeze-thaw cycles to help start breaking down some of the tightness of their soil. Chemical processes are generally associated with the type of cation that you have on the exchange sites. Some cations, calcium, magnesium, tend to encourage flocculation. That helps those soil particles come together in order to form aggregates. If you have a system where it's dominated by a sodium cation, that tends to disperse that system a little bit. And you've got a special set of circumstances that you've got to deal with. And of course, the biological processes are associated with the activities of those soil organisms. Talk a little bit more about those. One of the most prominent ones is this bioturbation, basically, is the growing, molding activity of earthworms and other large animals in the soil that actually dig and stir the soil a little bit. Nature's tillage is right here, bioturbation. Then we've got the binding of those soil particles by the hyphae of the fungi in the soil, as well as the roots of the plants that are growing in the soil. So those fibrous root systems tend to encourage soil aggregation, and so that's something that we look at putting in there. And then the production of organic glues by microorganisms, primarily of bacteria and fungi. One that you probably hear a lot about is glomalin, which is an organic compound that is produced by mycorrhizal fungi. And it's a great cementing thing. What it does is it takes the aggregate that started to naturally form with the roots and the hyphae holding it together and basically wraps it in a water-resistant coating. It helps protect that aggregate and keep it from breaking down too readily. Water holding capacity, plant available water is considered that that's between permanent wilt and field capacity. And it's a function of your texture, porosity, and organic matter content. How does organic matter influence it? As a direct influence, because it's kind of like a sponge. So really, the higher organic matter content, the more water the soil is going to hold. And they said for a silt loam, if we go from 1 to 6%, and 6% organic matter in a silt loam is probably a bit of a challenge, we can increase the amount of available water from about 10% to about 30% in that particular soil. And most of that's associated with that organic fraction. And an indirect effect then is because of its improving soil structure, reducing bulk density, improved porosity. We're going to have better water flow into the soil and more pores for the soil water to occupy. Nutrient holding capacity is another impact of organic matter as well as the clay content in the soil. One measure that we have of nutrient holding capacity is the cation exchange capacity. Most of the primary crop nutrients that you deal with are cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, to name three. Ammonium ion is another cation, and so basically it defines how well the soil retains those cations. It's a function of the clay content and type of clay that you have in the soil, as well as the pH and the organic matter. At a pH of 7, the cation exchange capacity for individual soil or clay minerals ranges from about 4 for your aluminum and iron oxide type minerals to about 150, and I believe that's vermiculite. I can't remember which one's on the upper end, but probably vermiculite. Whereas the organic colloids, it's about 200. So you see that organic matter can have a pretty significant impact on the cation exchange capacity and therefore the nutrient holding capacity. Just a quick, just to see if you can do math today. We'll estimate what the CEC of the soil is based on its clay content and organic matter content. So we have a silt loam soil. I chose the Crofton silt loam. It's a pretty dominant soil northeast and north central part of Nebraska. A typical Crofton silt loam is about 25% clay, about 1.5% organic matter. The clay type in most soils in Nebraska, in fact most soils in the Midwest, here in mollisols, is pretty much dominated by our 2-to-1 layer silicated clays, or smectites. And they have a CEC of about 80 centimoles of charge per kilogram. So we start out here, we've got 25% clay, so it's 0.25 kilograms times 80, which is the charge. So we have about 20 centimoles of charge associated with clay. And do you remember what the organic CEC was? 200, okay? So Organic matter, then we're going to take that 0.015, since it's 1.5% times 200. We have about 3 centimoles of charge associated with the organic fraction, which in this particular soil, probably not that big a deal. It doesn't make up that big of a percentage. We have a total of 23. If we increase the organic matter in that soil to 3%, which is easily doable in a soil like the Crofton soil, I imagine maybe organic matter in those is probably 3 to 5% under natural, when they're under native grass situations. So we could increase it to 26. Now that's not a huge increase, but if you think of a situation where you're dealing with something like a loamy sand or a fine sandy loam where you only have 10% clay or less, then that organic matter becomes all the more important for building the nutrient holding capacity of that soil. In addition to the cation exchange capacity, we also have that organic matter being the primary source of some of the nutrients. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Typical soil organic matter in general contains 50–60% organic carbon or carbon. About 3 to 6% nitrogen, so we usually have somewhere in stable organic matter a carbon-nitrogen ratio of about 10 or 15 to 1. So that's where we get 3 to 6% nitrogen. About 0.5 to 0.6% phosphorus. And then about 0.15 to 2% sulfur. So it's a source of several plant nutrients. And actually, our nutrient budgets usually account for the mineralization of some of the organic matter. Now, if we're trying to build organic matter, we might have to look at ways to put more nutrients into the system in order to get that nutrient or organic matter to increase. So what are some of our keys to improving soil health? What can we do? These are the 4 keys that NRCS has come up with as part of our soil health campaign. Keep the soil covered as much as possible. Disturb the soil as little as possible. Keep plants growing throughout the year to feed the soil, or as much as possible throughout the year. There's probably parts of the time of the year that you're not going to have plants growing, although I'm told that we have our brassicas, our turnips, and radishes overwintering for the 2nd consecutive year, which surprised me. Last year I could say it was a mild winter, okay. This year it's been pretty darn cold and they're still making it. So, interesting adaptation by that particular plant. Diversify as much as possible using your crop rotation and by including cover crops in the crop rotation. 2 types of soil cover. Keep the soil covered. There's 2 types of soil covered. This is terminology that was used by both Rykowski and Jerry Hatfield. There's passive soil cover, and that's basically your crop residue. That's what's laid out there after you harvest your crop. And we have our active soil cover, and that's the cover crops. This is a slide here that has got radishes that were actually planted as a cover crop in the western part of the state. They were spring planted, and I think this was taken probably late May here, about the time that he was thinking about getting these terminated, because obviously they're starting to bloom and it's time to terminate. It's a beautiful picture. So this is from the western part of the state. Actually, both those pictures are from the western part of the state. What are some of the benefits then of crop residue or cover crops protecting that crop cover? Is protect the soil surface, improve infiltration and runoff, and reduce runoff, reduce evaporation, moderate soil temperature. Something that we don't often think about, but that's something that we need to think about. Because those organisms in the soil, they don't like it hot any more than you and I do like it hot. So, got to take that into consideration. If it gets too hot, they shut down. They go dormant. They don't work for you. So if we protect the soil surface, why do we protect it? Well, raindrop impact destroys soil aggregates, disperses the soil particles, and it creates soil crust. This is probably an excessively tilled condition here, as you can see, and we've got a good crust going out there. And once we have that happen, once we destroy the structure in the surface, we get increased runoff and soil erosion. And I saw lots of this last spring in Nebraska too. We had lots of rain in about April and May, and then it just quit. So actually, my lawn looked great in April and May, and it looked really bad in July. So. Somebody talked about the rainfall simulator demonstration, and then unfortunately we didn't. I don't have the rainfall simulator here, but I can show you how it works and what we do with it. We have a pointer thing somewhere. Yeah, this is the setup of the rainfall simulator, and it's evolved over time. Actually, this is our newer rainfall simulator here, and this is an older one that Kansas used to have, and we borrowed Kansas's rainfall simulator to do some training in Nebraska. We borrowed their agronomist too. That's Bud. I don't know. I can't think of Bud's last name now, but Bud Davis. He used to be a state agronomist in Kansas, and he came up and did this for us. But the way we set it up is basically we have 5 trays. These 2 trays on the right-hand side, the first one is basically our ideal condition. Our ideal no-till condition is basically usually sod. Usually been sod for at least 30 years, so it's in really great condition. The next one over here is basically the same soil. It's the soil material from right beneath the sod, so it's very well aggregated. So you see it's nice and dark, and it's got good aggregation. The third pan here, the one in the middle, is our bad conditions situation. It's a soil that's been excessively tilled. It has very low organic matter content. It has very little structure in it. And this was probably a Crofton soil, actually, the one that I brought up in the CEC calculation, same soil. They beat it to death quite a little bit. It's D+, it's pretty forgiving. But that's what we have here. So we have basically this tilled soil with no residue cover. This is the same soil as tilled with about 30% residue cover. We call that our D- soil. Basically, that's the minimum that you could probably get by with and be in compliance, and actually very seldomly we let 30%, particularly on those slopes, even be adequate to be in compliance. I mean, we usually say about 45% to be in compliance on those slopes. So but that's 30%, and then this basically does 100% residue cover on that same soil. So these 3 soils are all the same. These 2 are the same, just this one has the growing sod. Okay, so then we rain on it. We put on probably 1.5 inches, 2 inches of water in about 15 minutes. So that's a pretty intense rainstorm. So we're looking at, what, 6 inches an hour? That's a pretty intense rainstorm. And we look and see how much runoff and erosion occurs on these particular soils. And you can see that this pan that had the sod is pretty good. The runoff that did occur is very minimal, and it's very clear. There's no soil loss involved there at all. The soil that was bare but we had good aggregation, we had a little bit more runoff, a little bit of sediment, but not a lot. So it performed well. Down at the other end where we had all that residue cover, again, runoff was about the same as it was with the sod. But you can see a little bit more sediment because we have a fairly finely divided soil there. And then these other 2 situations you can see, we got a jar full of muddy water going right there. So this is a take-home message, okay? We're getting a lot of runoff from this and a lot of soil erosion where we have poor aggregation and allow that dispersion and runoff to occur. On the other side of the coin, it's infiltration. How much, if you're getting runoff, you're not getting the water in the soil. So it's still back to partitioning the solute flow. And so what we do is we take those pans and we flip them over after we've rained on them for 15 minutes and got that 1.5 inches or 2 inches of water. These pans are about 2 inches thick. So it doesn't take, you wouldn't think theoretically, put 1.5 inches water on there, it would take very long to get to the bottom of the pan. And in the case of the well-aggregated soil and the soil with the sod, you can see they're pretty much wet all the way to the bottom of the pan. This one, no cover, mulch, very heavily tilled soil. It's still dry on the bottom of the pan. In fact, it's dry about halfway into the pan. And this is a lot of times an aha moment, as Dan likes to call it, because you flip that pan over and the producers are going, put all that water on there and none of it got into the soil? But just switching to maintaining cover on the soil surface, it still enabled the water to infiltrate into that particular done very well. In fact, Rolf Dirch down in South America says that the biggest benefit of no-till is not the fact that you're lacking soil disturbance. The biggest benefit is that you're maintaining that residue on the surface. I don't totally agree with that, but it has a big effect, and this demonstration shows that very well. Hey, some of the other effects then, well, we notice that it improves infiltration. It also reduces evaporation. Dwayne often talks about taking the E out of ET. Evapotranspiration is basically the water that comes through the plant as well as it evaporates from the soil surface. We don't really want it evaporating from the soil surface. It doesn't produce any rain that way. It doesn't help our plant that way. So we want to take the E out of ET, and by having that soil cover on there, it will do that. A study that was done by Norman Clucky down in Kansas, it's been several years ago now, he found that just by leaving the residue on the surface, it saved 3.5 inches of water. That would translate in a dryland system to about 40 bushel of corn. And if it's irrigated, that would be a savings of about $25 or $35 an acre, and that's probably too old a data, Randy. What does it cost to put on 3.5 inches of water?
$9-10 an acre inch.
$9-10 an acre inch, so it's still about 35. Yeah, it's still a reasonable number. I'm amazed. This slide is fairly old, so moderate soil temperature, something that we don't often think about. But these two soils are side by side. This comes from the Dakota Lakes Research Center up there. This is one of Dwayne's pictures, or well, these are his pictures. I incorporate them into my slide. But you can see that where he had no residue cover there, the temperature on that particular day is 107 degrees. Where he had actually a growing cover crop, the temperature is 87.6. 20 degrees difference in those two soils, just because one is covered, and I'm sure because it has that growing cover crop, that's helping a little bit too, because you've got some transpiration going on there and some humidity in that canopy that's helping bring that temperature down. But the soil organisms, which soil organisms are going to be happier? The ones that are in the bare situation or the ones under the cover crop? It's going to be those ones under the cover crop. Well, this is okay, we can take this. And the moisture level underneath that cover is going to be better too. This is one of Don Rykowski's slides. Again, I had to kind of rebuild it to make it work, but basically disturb the soil as little as possible. Intensive tillage destroys the biological and ecological integrity of the soil system. And he basically, this is a classic NRCS picture, or picture of the soil food web, shows all the different organisms in the soil. And he basically took that picture and said, okay, if we go through it once with a primary tillage tool, we're going to break it up a little bit. So he broke it up a little bit, and then after secondary tillage, he broke it up a lot more. Now, if this is your home, you're not going to like this too much. Somebody comes in there and tears it apart for you. One of his other slides, I didn't try to incorporate that one. He basically said that for soil organisms, tillage is the equivalent of an earthquake, a tsunami, a hurricane, a tornado, and a fire all happening to us at the same time. Maybe extreme, but it gets the point across. If you had any one of those things happen to your house, you'd understand what it's like for these soil organisms. And it takes them a while to rebuild that community once you've destroyed it. Don says that tillage creates twin problems. First of all, it accelerates soil degradation. And second of all, it accelerates soil erosion, which in some ways to me, soil erosion is soil degradation as well. So they kind of fit together there. Then I had to put a Dwayne Beck quote in here. He says that for soil organisms, tillage is a catastrophe. And we get back to our hurricanes and earthquakes. Under reduced tillage and direct seeding systems, soil biotic can build and maintain soil pore networks. And creating those stable habitat is the first step toward having your soil function to your advantage. The next step is crop rotation. Keep plants growing all year. Benefits of cover crops. And basically these benefits are cover crops. If you go to the NRCS cover crop standard, that's basically the purposes for growing cover crops. Reduce erosion, increase soil organic matter content, capture, recycle, and redistribute nutrients. Liz was talking about including buckwheat in rotation to try to get that phosphorus cycling in the soil. Promote biological nitrogen fixation, the peas, the beans, the lentils, putting those in with your cover crops or growing those as a commodity crop. Increase the biodiversity, suppress weeds. If you remember back to the very beginning, one of the concerns that was expressed in that paper was that we would have weed and pest issues. And doing the things that will help improve soil health will help address some of those issues. It can be used to manage soil moisture and to minimize or reduce soil compaction. I just want to highlight some of these. Capture and recycle nutrients. Cover crops such as wheat, rye, oats, and sorghum-sudangrass, which establish quickly and have a fibrous root system, are ideal for scavenging excess nitrates from the soil profile. Ideally this fall, if we could have had moisture, it would have been a great time to plant cover crops because we had a lot of residual nutrients in the soil since corn did not do so well. But it was tough for me to recommend to anybody that they put in a cover crop when they didn't have any moisture to get the cover crop out. But it would have been a perfect time. I had several people under irrigation actually do it. And we had, obviously, some people down here in southeast Nebraska who were very successful. Brassicas, such as oilseed radishes and turnips, are also good scavengers. They establish more slowly and they will winter kill, maybe. Apparently they don't always. And they're great at re-releasing that nutrient the following spring. So, and actually we have a lot of our seed corn producers in the state. Actually, our seed corn agronomists are now requiring that some of our seed corn producers actually plant turnips or radishes following seed corn as a way to take up some of that extra nitrogen. And one of the comments I've heard from a producer is he says, it smells a little funny in the spring when they start to break down, but then that re-releases those nutrients back to the following crop. So, and then growing deep-rooted crops may help redistribute some of those micronutrients in the soil profile, or even macronutrient like phosphorus, make them more available to the subsequent crop. Biological nitrogen fixation, we've all seen the nodules on the roots of plants. They fix atmospheric nitrogen through that symbiotic relationship with rhizobium. Growing legume cover crops can supply additional nitrogen to the subsequent crop, providing that a majority of the above ground biomass is returned to the soil. You're going to harvest the above ground biomass and you're probably not going to get as much benefit, if any benefit at all. It's like you probably don't get a lot of benefit from growing soybeans because you're harvesting the majority of that with wheat. Some of the considerations is they work best when nitrogen limited. Most of these crops are lazy. Like a soybean is a lazy crop. If the nitrogen's there, it ain't going to make any. It's just going to use what's available. So, and how well they work really, how much they fix really depends on the legumes. Different legumes, different varieties, different species fix different amounts of nitrogen. And this is one of those areas that really needs a little bit more work in knowing how much nitrogen is being produced, how quickly is it recycled in the system so that it's available to my subsequent crop. Suppress weed. A healthy stand of cover crops can outcompete weeds for light and nutrients. So by including a weed or another crop in your rotation, that may help reduce your weed pressure. Also, it helps diversify that cropping system a little bit too, which also will help reduce your weed pressure as well as some of the pest pressure. The mulching effect in and of itself can help reduce weed by reducing the light. We don't stir the soil too much. We're not getting that exposure of the seed, so those things help. Some types of cover crops do produce chemical exudates that inhibit weed growth, the allelopathic effects. Sometimes those are short-lived. That's one of the concerns I know with people that have rye, using zero rye, and plant corn into it are always concerned about that. And the key there is, at least from my producers that have done this, is if you're going to kill the rye, you want to kill it at least 2 weeks before you plant so that it's brown. before you plant, or you plant into it and then you kill it once the corn is up. Either way works. In addition to controlling weeds, cover crops can also help break pest cycles. They serve as great habitat for beneficials, pollinators, and so that is another benefit. Some cover crops, such as some of the mustards, actually work as soil fumigants and can help control some of the nematode pests that we have out there. And actually they're trying to develop some cover crop species now that are more adept at producing more of those so that they do a better job controlling some of the pests in its own system. Now, cover crops can become a weed if you don't manage them well. Buckwheat is one of those, I'm told. You don't want it to go to seed, or you'll be struggling with it for many years. And so you want to make sure you terminate those then before they do go to seed or produce viable seed. Sprouse wheat, here's that roller going for you. The roller crimper. This roller crimping rye up here in the upper left, and then they planted, I believe, it's soybeans into that rolled and crimped rye down there in the right-hand corner. And you see that we don't really have much weed issue going right there. We have such a nice mat of rye. Plus we have cooler soil temperatures, we're retaining soil moisture, we're taking the E out of ET. So there's a lot of benefits. Increase the biodiversity. Just a couple of different cover crops there. It allows addition of different plant types to your rotation. Corn bean gets pretty boring. You got a warm season broadleaf or warm season grass. So adding something like a cool season broadleaf or a cool season grass might really be beneficial. And if you aren't willing to throw wheat into your rotation, and I'm a big advocate on corn bean rotation, and maybe considering putting wheat into your rotation, because that's going to give you a better window for planting cover crops, and it's going to give you more diversity out there, and it's going to help you with controlling your weeds and your pests. So I think there's a lot of pluses to having that small grain cereal in there. And also adding diversity to plant species helps speed the biological life in the soil. And Chris Nichols is a ARS researcher. She's another rhizosphere ecologist. And one thing that Chris always talks about in terms of feeding the soil microbes is that if you, particularly talking about a wheat fallow rotation, so what are you feeding your microbes? What are you feeding them wheat? When are you feeding them? Well, once every 2 years, they get fed. So, yeah, you got hungry microbes out there, and you're always feeding them the same thing. And it's like, she says, it's like eating donuts. She says, I like donuts as much as the next person. But if I had a steady diet of just donuts, would I be very healthy? Probably not. Same goes with soil organisms. They need a diverse diet. They need a better buffet out there to choose from. So biodiversity improves flexibility, it improves resilience, improves resistance, and it's the ultimate insurance. So, just summarizing here, their keys for improving soil health: keep it covered as much as possible, disturb it as little as possible, keep something growing out there all the year. Got to feed those soil organisms. Make them happy. You don't want to eat just part of the year. You like to eat every day, I'm sure. They're just like you. Diversify as much as possible using crop rotations and cover crops. And so my conclusions, and I borrowed a little bit from Jerry on conclusions, and I tweaked them a little bit too. Sustainable systems will have to be able to cope with the changing climate. And that may mean changing our crop rotations. One key to resilient cropping systems is to improve soil health and the ability of the soil to function. And managing the soils as part of the cropping system will increase the efficiency of water use